Welcome to Superhero Century. It is the first episode of our podcast series here on the Cinema Composite channel. We are here. We're going to review a bunch of superhero movies from this century. I'm Dan. Joining me are...
I'm Tom.
I'm Matt.
And I'm Kat.
The Dream Team. We're all here. We are looking at every superhero movie this side of the year 2000. We picked that date semi-arbitrarily, but it is the century of superheroes. It is the genre that really captured this era of movies, dominated the box office. So we've decided to watch every superhero movie in that span, and we are starting with the 2000 film X-Men, the film that started it all. The way this podcast is going to work is we are going to watch these movies, really break them down, have a lot of fun with them. These are not serious podcasts. We're just going to, watch them. We've got a couple categories to really dissect some of the details of these superhero movies. Some of them are great, some of them are terrible, but we're going to look at all of them.
I do want to remind everyone here that it has been 20 years. So a lot has changed in the movie industry in 20 years, and you can tell.
That's true. We're going to get to that today with X-Men debuting in the summer of 2000, which is almost exactly 20 years ago.
That's insane. Hate that.
We wanted to start with X-Men, one, because we have a soft spot for this movie. I think it's a movie that we grew up with, but also it is kind of the kicking off point of the modern superhero era. Obviously, there are superhero movies before 2000 with the Superman franchise, all the Batman movies, but in terms of like the modern sense of building franchises, maybe bringing together heroes that you wouldn't be familiar with, digging deep into these comic book stories.
Well, really getting to use CGI, I think that really came into
Definitely.
fruition for 2000.
The 90s were interesting for superhero movies because prior to that, with the exception of the Batman series, which I'm sure we can spend a little more time talking about, but everything else from this era seemed a little more geared towards adults. I mean, you had stuff like Judge Dredd, Spawn, The Crow, Blade. X-Men was a little different because it was the first one that felt like it was geared towards a younger crowd. We were talking about 8 or 9 or something like that when this came out, and this felt directly, marketed towards me.
I feel like this is a good balance of like funny but dramatic, and I don't know, kind of started to kick off this we can do this new superhero movie, I guess.
It's also, I think, apart from maybe Mystery Men, it might have been the first superhero movie that incorporated like a bunch of different heroes. Am I wrong with that?
No, and I'm so glad you brought up Mystery Men because that movie's so damn good. Of all the superhero movies in the 90s, that's probably my favorite one, like until X-Men hits the scene.
Well, especially like in the modern era of superhero movies, every movie is trying to incorporate so many different heroes and different plot lines. That wasn't necessarily a thing back in the day. X-Men was the first time where they really decided we're going to introduce 12 characters here and try to interweave these stories.
It's definitely the first team outside of Batman and Robin, if you will.
So before we get into X-Men, the movie, I'm going to run down some quick facts. Directed by Bryan Singer. We'll talk about him later, I'm sure. Written by David Hayter, and also written by like 14 other people wrote this movie and did a bunch of different drafts. But David Hayter, he also did X2 and Watchmen, but that's pretty much it. That's all he's ever really done.
Not a bad list.
Debuted July 14th, 2000, had a budget of $75 million. Anyone want to guess what the box office was for this?
God, it's got to be huge.
I sure don't.
Worldwide, it made $296 million.
Wow.
So enough where it really told studios that superhero movies might be the way to go.
It's
right.
lucrative.
It makes sense that it kicked off this big trend.
That's crazy considering I don't think they have any idea that it was going to make that much money. But this movie, and I'll get into that later, does a great job of setting up the next one.
Just to give some context for the cinema landscape at the time, we just talked about this is post-Batman, and that franchise really kind of flamed out by the end of the 90s. Batman and Robin was truly awful. Yeah. And that was really Blade was obviously around, but not a huge hit.
Different things.
In 1999, The Matrix and The Phantom Menace came out, made a ton of money, but really forced special effects into a new realm.
Forced.
Yeah, exactly.
Well done.
The development of X-Men actually began way back in 1984 with Orion Pictures, and James Cameron and Catherine Bigelow were originally attached to produce and direct it.
Which could have been awesome.
Yeah. I mean, if anyone's going to figure out special effects in the 80s, it's James Cameron to make this work. 20th Century Fox bought the rights to this movie after the success of the animated show.
The animated show was also a pretty big reason for Bryan Singer to get into it. Apparently, he was not interested the first couple times they asked, and then he watched the entire animated series and was like, okay, I get the story they're trying to tell. I get why this is important.
In terms of development, this was written in the 90s by a bunch of different people. Joss Whedon famously wrote a script, and I think they used parts of the script in the
It
final
was like
version.
a couple lines or
Yeah.
something.
I hope it wasn't the Toad and Lightning bit.
No, I'm pretty sure he did
it
the line that was
might have been.
like, "You're a dick."
That's
That
That-
line.
the best line.
It is also funny. Like, you have to acknowledge the fact that, for a big genre thing, this came hot off the heels of Buffy, which
that's
I'm
true.
sure there's a lot of overlap in that crowd.
I'm not sure if you were trying to set it up, Dan, but with all those writers, they were the true X-Men getting together to create this.
Another one was Christopher McQuarrie, who has worked with Bryan Singer a lot, but he's most famous now for directing the last couple of Mission Impossible movies. Original directing choices, once 20th Century Fox came aboard, Brett Ratner, who famously did X-Men 3, which was terrible. They also offered it to Robert Rodriguez, which would have been interesting, and also
makes sense.
Paul W.S. Anderson.
Can you imagine?
After the success of Usual Suspects, Fox actually offered Bryan Singer Alien Resurrection as a directing gig, but he didn't really want that. They tried to convince him to do some kind of big blockbuster, and they eventually convinced him to do X-Men.
Cool.
We'll get into some more trivia in a bit, but let's talk about your reaction to the movie. First, what did this mean to you personally as you grew up watching this? And also, what did you notice on this rewatch now in 2020?
For me, coming into this, I was aware of the cartoon series, but I wasn't a big fan. I know it's a weird thing to say, but I remember going home from school and thinking that the animation was more geared to be 90s because it's a very 90s cartoon
It is,
with
yeah.
like the teenage angst I think of. I had no interest in really seeing this movie, but I did see it when it was on TV a million times. I think this is maybe the second time I've ever seen it on a DVD or Blu-ray, so it's really just my memory of seeing bits on television.
Yeah, it definitely ran on TNT for days.
And
on
nothing
end.
was edited out. in
So
the TV
I'm
version.
I'm the odd one out here because I'm guessing I would have seen this in theaters. I don't remember for a fact, but this seems like something that my dad would have taken me to see.
It helps you have a nerdy dad.
Yeah, I love you, Dad. So I got to go see this. I was always into like genre fiction and stuff. So it probably didn't even strike me how unique this was to have a really successful superhero, comic book movie. It didn't feel like a big deal to me then, but I think looking back now, I realize that it was.
I'm with Matt and Dan here. I don't think I watched this in theaters. I probably didn't watch it for a couple of years after it came out. And it was funny rewatching it now how much I remember from the movie because I really don't think I gave it the time of day when I was younger. So it was interesting to watch it now and just see how much of it was like, oh yeah, this is what that came from. So I don't know.
Oddly enough, being younger, I think my favorite parts of it were Magneto. He's my favorite part of the whole series. Ian McKellen kills it.
Well, and that's the thing is, I mean, it's actually a relatively high caliber cast.
Oh, it's a great cast.
Yeah, we'll get into that in a second. I think.
But like to have someone like Ian McKellen and Patrick Stewart, to have them in something like this is really crazy because with any, lesser actors, it could have been a real shit show.
That's what I got watching it this time was this might have been the first time, maybe not the first time, using Shakespearean actors to deliver just kind of exposition dialogue, maybe not the most compelling dialogue, but when you have such great acting talent delivering these lines, they sell it and they take it so seriously. I mean, before this, we had serious actors in comic book movies. I'm thinking like Jack Nicholson and Tommy Lee Jones.
Arnold Schwarzenegger.
Danny DeVito.
Sure. I mean, like those are all good actors, but they're hamming it up. Like this is
Sure.
That's their opportunity to have like a super fun time on set. Those performances serve those movies fine. But the fact that, this movie starts in a concentration camp.
It's serious.
And Magneto is a serious character where to the point where he's not just like maniacally laughing every time he talks.
Right.
It makes you at least take the character seriously.
Yeah. I mean, you mentioned it starting in a concentration camp, which is a bold move.
That's a bold move.
That's a bold move.
And damn it if it doesn't work. It's
It
one of
does.
my favorite sequences of the whole film.
The parallel is just, it's obviously clear and
It's amazing.
and it makes a lot of sense. It was, again, it was bold, but it paid off.
Something that surprised me today watching this is I assumed this was like a 2.5 hour movie because like there's so much that goes on in it, and it's only an hour and 44 minutes. It's amazing how quick this movie moves, especially when you realize that they're trying to set up like 12 different characters.
There's a lot.
Like the first 40 minutes are like just like one scene of setting up a different character essentially. And
Kat, maybe that's why you remember it so well, is because it's just so compact that
Yeah.
there's
Right.
not a whole lot to forget.
It's impressive that they can do so much in such a short movie, especially for someone like me going in who probably was like, I have no idea what any of these people are doing here.
What's an
What is
X-Man?"
an X-Man?
I think that's the strength and the weakness of this film. The weakness is that you really don't get enough of any character to really know a lot about them or what they're really trying to go for, but it's also very efficient at what it's doing in an hour and 45 minutes
It teases it out where you want to
Exactly.
hear
Yeah.
more about them.
Yeah.
And I it's tough to say because I have such a knowledge of these characters, but does this do a good job of setting them up like as characters? There are a lot of characters you meet, but do I actually think it set them up well, or is it just because I mentally know everything about them already?
I think it sets up at least Wolverine, Professor X, and Magneto enough where you're on their side.
The main characters.
I remember watching this. I didn't know anything about X-Men when I watched this originally on cable.
Right.
And I remember going around the house with knives between my fingers from the kitchen. And
Wow.
Dan is a really big Wolverine
Oh my
fan.
God.
I mean, yeah,
He has the scars to prove it.
exactly. I mean, there's enough here where I think it gets you on board into this world. Obviously, like there are characters that really get shortchanged here, like Cyclops and Storm. However
Yeah,
that
they're
anything to do.
hardly in it.
I try to nitpick that just because it's like, God, deep down they had to know they weren't getting a sequel. So like, here's one of these characters. Let's see how many we can cram in because this might be the only chance we get.
For the most part, I still enjoyed it, which is impressive.
I think overall it was better than I had remembered.
Yeah.
The final action sequence isn't as climactic as I'd want it to be. It's
Right.
It's fine.
It's not great, but it's not as bad as I remember.
Right.
That's for sure.
Yeah. So let's get into some categories. First, I just want to rattle off some trivia. These are just things I found on the internet. Could be true, could be false. Who knows? Feel free to react to anything I say.
Just remember, we might be lying to you.
The producers wanted to include Nightcrawler, Beast, and Gambit in this movie, but they cut them not just for time, but also for cost. That would have been harder with special effects to produce Nightcrawler in this movie.
It pays off, though, for Nightcrawler.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Next to
They
it.
probably blew too much of the budget on that roar Sabretooth gives, which I think they ripped straight from MGM,
In which case, it should have been super cheap. But,
in theory.
Brian Singer thought Magneto's plan to stop persecution by converting world leaders into mutants was a parallel to the Roman Emperor Constantine converting to Christianity.
Wow. That is a bold,
I mean,
deep...
Sure, yeah.
I think of it as the villains in the Batman 66 film where they turn the world leaders into dust.
Oh, I've not seen that, but sounds right. And this is pretty obvious, but Senator Kelly is meant as a stand-in for Senator McCarthy during the Red Scare, trying to identify mutants.
That's pretty obvious with
it-
the list bit.
It is obvious unless you're watching this in a modern lens, in which case it seems way too modern and current.
Yeah, we'll
That's
talk
true.
about that later too.
Yeah.
I think. This was filmed mostly in Toronto. Hugh Jackman took ice cold showers every day to get into character.
Yeah, so I saw the same bit, and it was because the first day he tried to take a shower and the water heater wasn't on, and he was shocked and had to hold in a scream to not wake his wife or whatever, and he realized that was the mindset he needed to be in, so he just took cold showers every morning.
I just assumed he'd seen himself like in a mirror and just needed the cold shower. That's where I thought you were going
Hugh
with this.
Jackman's the kind of man a man wants when a man wants a man, but I also
Amen.
like Hugh Jackman too.
Huge Jack man.
Huge Jackman.
Huge Jackman.
Although he's not as jacked in this one
No,
as he
he's
is in the
really
other ones.
not.
He's a lightweight. In that fighting scene at the... Yeah,
Yeah,
that's...
he's more attainable in this one.
I'd still have a chance.
God, his hair.
This is my favorite piece of trivia. Hugh Jackman is from Australia. There are no Wolverines in Australia, and he had no idea a Wolverine was an animal. He assumed the character was based on some kind of wolf. He had no...
This is another bit of trivia that I think is fake.
I've heard this several times.
Okay.
It was a few weeks into like prepping the character that Bryan Singer finally told him that a Wolverine was not a wolf.
That is great.
That's cute for him.
Apparently not a University of Michigan fan.
Yeah, I don't think that was possible, Dan.
That's a Dan reference.
Can
right
we get
there.
through a
That's Dan
podcast
trying
without
to do
Dan bringing up sports?
The Mansion is also the same mansion from Billy Madison.
And what was the other movie I said?
Ready or not?
Ready or Not.
Probably been in a few movies, I'm guessing. Bryan Singer allowed Ian McKellen to rearrange his filming schedule so he could go shoot Lord of the Rings in New Zealand.
Oh.
This is one of the most important pieces of trivia because if Ian McKellen hadn't been Gandalf, this world wouldn't be worth living in.
I'm really glad he got to be both because
Yeah.
I can't imagine anyone else being Magneto.
Right. Yeah, no, it is great that he got to do both.
Well, we'll get to some casting decisions later, but there is one other person I could see being a really good Magneto.
Ooh.
Yeah, a
I
little
wanna know
teaser.
now.
Yeah.
On the edge of my seat.
They got rid of the blue and yellow uniforms from the comic, and it was very controversial. I think they released some photos online, and it was kind of early age of the internet where there's a lot of nerds that were very outraged.
We all know that the internet is no longer a bunch of nerds getting mad about movies, so we're good now.
Yeah.
But Stan Lee famously was in approval of the black uniforms, so I think that calmed some fears.
Nice.
The box office success of this movie allowed Marvel to greenlight other movies, including Spider-Man, Fantastic Four, Hulk, and Daredevil.
And one of those was worth it.
Yes, only one.
The most controversial line in the movie, the famous Halle Berry, "Do you know what happens when a toad gets struck by lightning" line? There's a lot of controversy about where that originated. Originally, Halle Berry said she ad-libbed it, and she got a lot of heat for that. Then there's a rumor that Joss Whedon wrote that line.
That's what I've read.
Yeah.
But the true story, from what I've read, is that there were some setup scenes between Storm and Toad where Toad keeps taunting her with that similar line, and it's more of a callback to that joke.
Weird.
They cut those scenes out.
It's a weird thing that Halle Berry would want to claim that.
Yeah.
I came up with that.
So
I'm not sure.
What I had seen about that, and again, these are all just found off the internet, so who knows? Was that it was intentionally supposed to be a very like tongue-in-cheek, funny line, but she was just really insistent on saying it seriously.
Tongue in cheek.
Yes.
Sorry.
So I don't know if that makes it better or worse.
I really noticed this time, speaking of Toad, he has warts on his forehead. I don't know how I missed that before, but it was...
They're pretty blatant.
They're pretty blatant.
Yeah.
Any other trivia from you guys?
My absolute favorite piece of trivia is that a few years prior to this, there was a crossover novel with Star Trek Next Generation and X-Men.
Wow.
And in the novel, they talk about how Picard looks like Charles Xavier.
Yeah.
And also apparently Picard has a very potentially romantic relationship with Storm throughout. And
Wow.
nerds are the best, guys.
Wow. This is a trivia only for the nerdiest of nerds that love Are You Afraid of the Dark? The guy that plays the referee in the cage match is most famous for being the carnival barker in the Laughing in the Dark episode of Are You Afraid of the Dark?
I think that piece of trivia was meant just for you, Matt.
Well, you
I'm
never
really
know.
happy for whoever
never
can
know.
relate to you on that one.
Also fun trivia, the way the camper blows up is not how a usual camper would blow up under any circumstances. It almost looked like Magneto had lifted it into the air.
Yeah, there was like a gas stove in the back. Chemical reactions.
No.
Should we get into some casting decisions?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So originally, there's a ton of people involved with this movie that could have been in. When they originally were working on this in the 80s, their original choice for Wolverine was Bob Hoskins.
Yeah, I saw that, and that's
For
the best.
Wolverine?
Yeah.
Oh my god.
It's the best.
He is the closest to a human Wolverine I can think of. He's short, kind of stubby, and he's on, you wouldn't want to corner him.
Sure.
He's amazing.
The other thought they had in the 80s was Angela Bassett as Storm.
I love that.
That would have been awesome.
This is the one casting choice I wish they would have stuck with, because
Yeah.
I think Storm gets kind of a short change in this movie. Halle Berry is there, but she doesn't get a lot to do.
She's not great. She's not.
Angela
Also-
Bassett just like takes over whenever
Yeah.
she's on screen.
Yeah,
She would have been badass.
Also, Halle Berry, this is the only one where they tried to have her do the accent,
Yeah.
and she can't do it at all, so they just cut it.
I don't even know what you're talking
She has
about.
an African accent in this. It's very
it's
minimal.
It's bad.
Wow. I guess I completely missed that.
Yeah.
I think Angela Bassett could have pulled off the Toad Lightning line.
Oh yeah, that would have been
maybe.
awesome.
I think she would have made that work.
No, that would have been awesome.
All right.
Here are some other Wolverine options as they were casting this movie. Russell Crowe turned it down.
Oh.
Yeah, he was the first choice. And
I would have been
See it.
okay with that.
It could have worked. It would have been an interesting career for Russell Crowe
Yeah,
if
right.
he had gotten this role.
I'd like to think he'd be in much better shape than he is today.
well, because the other thing he was doing at the time was Gladiator.
Yeah, he had to turn it down for Gladiator.
So, like, to have that be the career trajectory is like that deciding point.
That's pretty cool.
Maybe he becomes an action star rather than an Oscar winner.
I mean, I know it wouldn't work because he was, I don't know what the ages were, but I know he lived a much harder life. Could you imagine Oliver Reed as Magneto? That would have been intense. Because he's in Gladiator.
Yeah, I
He
know.
died for the filming, but
As
he's-
Magneto, though?
Yeah, he's so like brooding.
I think he's a little too. He's not intellectual enough.
Oh, I
Yeah,
suppose
I don't
that's
know if
true.
I see it for Magneto.
All right,
Where is this going?
I don't know. Oliver Reed's great.
Sorry. You said Gladiator. I wanted to bring up Oliver Reed.
Other options for Wolverine: Doug Ray Scott.
He was cast, right?
He was cast in this role, and then he turned it down to do Mission Impossible 2.
How'd that work out?
I mean, he has a pretty good part in that movie, but he's not remembered at all today. So
I barely remember Mission Impossible 2, let
Right.
alone him.
Glenn Danzig was also offered the role.
Okay.
Other options were Keanu Reeves, Gary Sinise, Mel Gibson.
These are all Wolverines still.
These are
you're
all
saying.
Wolverines. Aaron Eckhart, Jean-Claude Van Damme,
Wow. That I would have watched.
Viggo Mortensen, and Edward Norton. Did you have any other ones for?
No,
Edward
that's
Norton.
the list I had.
Edward
but-
Norton. So
Wow.
all of those are really interesting. Hugh Jackman was actually kind of a risk at the time because he had not done an American movie before.
Did any of you guys think of someone that you could have seen play Wolverine other than Hugh Jackman? Because now I feel like, as somebody who didn't really know anything about X-Men going into this, like, Hugh Jackman is Wolverine to me.
That's the tough thing, is that he is, for most of our life been playing this character, and it's just so iconic.
I think in his, if I could do like a time machine casting for this, I think Jack Nicholson in his prime would have had a ball with it because he's
so
a little menacing.
scary.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I am always going to talk about how much I love Keanu Reeves, but thank God he did not get cast in this. 'Cause
Wolverine would have been really lost. Like, what are you? You're some kind of X-Men?
Professor X was pretty much always going to go to Patrick Stewart. That was
Yeah.
kind of a fan favorite and perfect casting.
They
there.
saved a lot of money on the hair.
Supposedly, when they wanted him to do this, they handed him an X-Men comic, and he had never heard of X-Men, and goes, "Why am I on the cover?" So there's that.
Other options for Magneto. I like both of these guys. I think they almost. Ian McKellen's great, but these guys could have done just as good a job. I think Terrence Stamp.
Yeah.
How would I know him, Dan? Why didn't that ring a bell for me?
You know Terrence
Yeah.
Stamp.
Okay.
The other one is Christopher Lee was considered for this role.
Yeah, but he's kind of like, and I know you poo-pooed my Oliver Reed, but he seems like he would have been too old for it. They
Probably-
definitely would have gotten
probably
enough
too old,
movies
yeah.
out of him.
I also think that Christopher Lee wouldn't have the same charm that Ian McKellen has. Like, Christopher Lee has the menacing, but I don't think he's necessarily got the
That's
like.
fair.
I
'cause
agree.
you can back McKellen a bit.
Christopher Lee doesn't have, you don't ever feel sympathetic for
Yeah.
him. He's just too menacing.
Yeah.
Other characters, Jim Caviezel was considered for Cyclops. You want to remember Jim Caviezel?
No, I love how you just
Hey,
rattled that off.
He's
Jim
a-
Caviezel
plays Jesus in The Passion of the Christ.
He's also excellent in The Thin Red Line. So I'm actually
yeah.
not.
And the Count of
upset
Monte
about
Cristo.
I'm sorry I didn't prepare these
Yeah.
these things for this podcast.
Storm. Other options were Janet Jackson and Mariah Carey.
Mariah Carey?
Thank God we
Yes.
avoided that.
Sounds like an internet lie, but whatever.
There are a couple of options for Rogue. Some hot names at the time: Drew Barrymore, Jennifer Love Hewitt, Sarah Michelle Gellar, Katie Holmes, Christina Ricci, Alicia Silverstone, and Natalie Portman.
I'm surprised. That sounds like a list that like Nev Campbell would have been on. Like I could
that's
close
true.
my eyes and
true.
read
You know,
that
She
list.
probably should have called her agent on that.
I honestly probably would have chosen most of them over Anna Paquin.
Yeah, Anna Paquin's acting is not my
Yeah.
favorite thing.
She's
A little
the
stilted.
worst part. of
Although
this
she
movie.
is younger than all of these people,
That's
I
true.
do like how Rogue is portrayed as more of a young teenager. I think all of these people would probably seem, maybe besides Natalie Portman, would seem too old for it.
I like to imagine that they took all those headshots and then they had a piece of like something that they'd be able to trace on top of it, and they just had a white streak, and they tried that on every one of their heads, and it just fit hers.
That
the
was
best.
it. That was the casting decision.
That's
right
how they
there.
did it.
Right.
Other options for Jean Grey, Selma Blair, Lucy Lawless, Maria Bello, and Helen Hunt.
No, I like their choice.
I think, yeah, it's a good choice. Famke Jenson's
Yeah.
good.
I had seen very potential Ben Affleck, Matt Damon, and Ethan Hawke for Cyclops. And,
Interesting.
Wow.
And
They almost seem too famous.
Oh,
for
so
me.
Yeah,
handsome.
right.
Oh my God.
I have to imagine they maybe turn it down because they're not going to see their eyes the entire movie. It's, it's kind of like
That's a good point, Dan.
It's kind of an ego,
Right.
reduction.
I don't know.
there.
I think of the three, only Damon could have pulled it off. I don't like. I can't picture Ben Affleck.
Matt Damon would have been really good. I
think he would have done
That'd
well.
been great.
Considering that these actors played these characters for basically like 20 years, I think it's solid casting.
Right.
All right, let's go on to best scene. Our favorite scene in this movie. First is the Wolverine introduction in the bar
cage
where
match.
he's in the cage
Oh,
match,
yeah.
leading all the way up to when he pulls the claws out for the first time against the guy. And
That shotgun
yeah,
slice.
I think
is-
that's a great character introduction.
It is a really great way to start the X-Men franchise because Wolverine is the most iconic of them.
The first Wolverine versus Sabretooth fight in the snow.
no.
I think
would
that's
say
pretty
no.
crappy.
Wolverine exploring the school for the first time is kind of fun, as he thinks he's kind of in this weird
Yeah.
facility.
It's
Okay.
a little goofy, the
All right.
whispering.
Mystique revealing herself in the helicopter.
That is
That's a good
that
bit.
is one of the
And
most iconic.
that's
ones,
definitely Quentin Tarantino's favorite part because the
Yes.
level of feet violence in
Yes.
My
that.
goodness.
The train sequence, leading from when Magneto gets Wolverine in the train and captures Rogue, leading all the way through when Magneto turns over the cop cars.
Right.
The cops shoot the guns and the bullets and all
I think.
that.
Less so the train part, but the face off with the cops is
That was
pretty great.
definitely the one scene that I remembered most
Yeah.
going into this. Like how I feel like all these movies sort of blend together for me, all the X-Men movies, just because they weren't my favorite growing up. And that was the one that I was like, Ooh.
I will say that I agree that is an iconic scene, like Magneto using all the guns against them. However, my brain kept trying to think. I think it's in 2. Don't cops show up to a house and they do something similar and they're frozen? There was something that my brain wanted to connect those two.
Yeah, I think
even though it
that's
is
2.
iconic.
Yeah, I think there's something in 2 where Professor X freezes time.
Right. Yeah. It's a similar standoff though.
Yep. Last couple nominees: the Statue of Liberty fight at the end, that whole sequence.
I thought you were going to say the Statue of Liberty moment where we learned that Mystique can turn into a statue, because that
Underrated
is
moment.
insane.
Yeah, it's something.
Oh,
I don't know. Nothing in the Statue of Liberty scene like really amazed me.
if anything, I think that's like some of the roughest, because they're
Yeah.
like in closed quarters, and it just
It's also when it should have been exciting and
right.
wasn't.
It's a big moment, and they're in like the head of the Statue of Liberty, and we just have to assume.
The one part I really like is the image of Magneto floating with the fireworks in the background.
Oh, that's
yeah.
great. Yeah.
And then my final nominee is the ending chess match between Professor X and Magneto. That's a very iconic moment for these characters.
I wrote down bubble prison or plastic prison. Is like that whole bit is just great.
It was actually a lot
there.
shorter than I remembered it.
So that was one of my nominees as well, but it also goes hand in hand with their scene after Jean Grey's Senate address.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, the relationship between the two is the most interesting thing in this movie, I think. So I kind of put those two together.
And I think that's the point of that. I mean, that's literally tailor made for that.
Any other nominees that I missed?
I do have when Wolverine has to walk through a metal detector, and which is just like a really funny, stupid.
When does
setup.
that happen? What did I?
When they go into the Statue of Liberty and he walks through the metal detector, everyone goes in front and it doesn't go off for any of them. He walks through, starts going, so he just stabs it.
And then he uses the middle finger.
Yeah, and then he
Oh, that's
retracts
right,
the
sorry.
two
Yes,
outside
that's
claws,
right.
so he
That's
flicks
right.
off.
I don't know if I
Wow.
consider that a scene, but a good moment.
It's a
It's
good
one of
bit.
the best. It's
It's
one
a
of the
good
best.
bit.
But then also shortly after, when he has to prove to Cyclops that he's not Mystique, and he just says, "You're a dick," and Cyclops is like, "Yep, it's him."
I have that written down as the best line of the movie for me, because that's classic banter.
Yeah, it's great.
My favorite scene, just because they had the balls to do it, is the Auschwitz. That opening, that's so dark, and how it's such an iconic scene that it gets used in another movie. Like they completely recreate it because it's just got so much emotion, and it does make you sympathetic for Magneto, even though he's the bad guy.
So vote on best scene. I'm going with the train sequence and the whole standoff with the police.
I don't really know if I want to vote for one, honestly, but
I'm with Dan here.
You're gonna have to vote, Matt.
okay.
I'm going chess match.
I think you said Holocaust. So
Well, yeah, I'll vote for the Holocaust scene. Well, no, you know what? I'll make a tie to ruin your guys' vote. I'll go with the beginning
my
bookends of
gosh.
Tom's, the Senate speech, and the chess at the end.
Thanks, Matt.
I will back it, because that chess scene, for one, we just watched the trailer for X2. They use that clip to set it up, because it's such, if you had to encapsulate the first
Right.
movie, there you go.
Yeah.
So I give it to Tom.
all right, let's move on to villain corner. We're gonna rate the diabolical plan of the villain, whether it was realistic, whether maybe they had a point with their scheme, whether they maybe made one fatal error. How realistic was Magneto's plan, and did it make any sense?
So upon watching this one, and I know it had been a while, and I know I just talked him up for how, great the opening scene was and stuff like that, I realized that he's just a Bond villain in this movie. The lair is straight from like a Bond set. He's got sidekicks that are terrible and goofy and have like the worst gimmicks, like the frog one and the saber-tooth one. Like there's not a lot of diversity other than Mystique.
His name is Toad.
What did I say?
You said frog.
You
There's
know
a
who I
very
mean.
clear difference.
Yeah, well, come on. But he is straight up Magneto, and the whole plan, everything, is straight from a Bond film.
My question was, what does he actually want? He says he wants a war between the mutants and the humans, but then he also wants to convert the world leaders into mutants, presumably for like tolerance or like.
I assume more to prove a point,
Right.
but
Yeah.
it's flimsy.
It's a little flimsy.
They make this big thing to convert Senator Kelly, when really it would have been way more effective, because then if he survives, then he is an example of why mutants are bad. If they kill him and just have Mystique impersonate him, like they can say whatever they want and really influence things.
So yeah, that was one of the biggest holes, that they
Yeah.
might as well have just had Mystique be the senator from the beginning.
Right, that's the ending of the movie.
Well, and then the other big thing that doesn't make any sense is using Rogue to transfer like the power, because
Right.
if he transfers his power to her, he becomes really weak, and now suddenly she can control metal. She can tear this thing apart.
Right.
She can tear him apart.
He doesn't have mind control over her. Like,
Yeah.
once she has the power, like she doesn't have to keep going.
Yeah, and not only does she have the choice to refuse, but she can literally kill him for doing that to it, because he's just making her really powerful.
She's inadvertently killing him.
Yeah, right. So it's like, why? I mean, that's some bad plotting
Even
right there.
even before that, I'm not 100% sure they say how Magneto even knows about Rogue. Like that, he doesn't have the same cerebral guessing unless I can't think of how he would know.
That's a good point. Also, if he has a machine that can create mutants, he should have created better henchmen, or at least a few more.
Right.
Like he knows that the X-Men are like 6 or 7 people. Like, why not have more than 3 guys to
I'll
help
take
him?
Toad and Sabretooth.
One of my main notes on here is why Toad. That's like literally I just wrote why Toad. So many X-Men characters, why Toad?
When I think of the that X-Men cartoon, I think of Toad. Was it the Blob?
Yeah.
Yeah.
They actually wanted to use the Blob in this movie, but they were worried that they have too many characters.
Too many characters.
They wanted to use the Blob and the Juggernaut for Magneto's team.
One of the other things I want to talk about villain plans is what does Mystique put in Cerebro that can make Professor X pass out?
Well, we don't even know what that chemical is.
What is it? Why does it work?
I think it was some kind of spinach smoothie.
Yeah. I mean, like, it's not like the chemical ever entered his body. It did. What was happening there?
It doesn't make any sense.
That annoyed me more than most things.
I mean, this is a character trait of a lot of these movies from the early 2000s was, even up until this day, is passing off like fake science as real science.
Quantum science?
Yeah, exactly.
Quantum, yes.
Next category, capes and tights. Let's rate the superhero costumes in this movie. We already talked about there was some controversy with not using the blue and yellow spandex. They used black leather.
Right.
How do we feel about the superhero costumes in this movie?
A lot more adult.
Yeah, I was gonna say I feel like it helps set the tone of making this a more like serious adult-like movie.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. But the problem is that everyone's wearing the same thing, and it's not that exciting.
Right.
It also feels very late 90s to wear leather.
Right.
Is this where we talk about Wolverine's hairstyling in this?
Oh,
I think this is where we talk
I
about
think that's why he
Wolverine's
was
hairstyle.
cage fighting, was for the money for more hair product. Because it is, I get it, you're a Wolverine.
It is weird. In other movies, he has like a similar style, but it doesn't look as like forced as this. I don't know what it is.
Yeah, they probably, they were trying to have it resemble the comics, and then this was the best they come up with. Like, yeah, that looks vaguely real.
He's not wearing black and yellow, so let's at least make the hair correct.
Yeah.
Maybe would have liked to have seen some nudity. That might have helped. I meant Wolverine when he's wearing that low cut sweatshirt running through the schools.
Just zip it up all the way, man.
They gotta show that chest hair.
Yeah.
They
Speaking of chest
CGI'd
hair, we got Patrick Stewart with.
Oh yes,
That's a Stern Bush.
that is
baby.
long.
I don't like you
forgot.
talking about my dad like that.
Well, you wonder where it goes on his head. It's all on the chest. That's the only hair he can grow.
Should we move on?
No.
No.
Who else's hair did you like? Body hair.
We had a category of that.
Do you assume that Toad's character doesn't have any body hair?
Just slime. He's just covered in mucus.
He's just a gooey boy.
I guess Mystique's makeup kind of falls under this.
That's an
which
iconic costume.
That's pretty good design.
For as long as she had to sit there and get it applied to her, I will count that.
Yeah,
as a
I'm
costume.
sure it was the worst experience ever.
I think they said like 9 hours or something by the end of by the end of it all, like once Jennifer Lawrence got up there, I think they got it down to 3, but in these first ones it was 9 hours.
It's really amazing her body wasn't like damaged like the original like Scarecrow for Wizard of Oz.
Probably
or something
was.
like that. Oof.
All right, next category. Which side character in this movie deserved their own spin-off?
Their own spin-off. Not Sabretooth.
My vote is for Ray Park. Not Toad, but for Ray Park.
Good luck to you on that.
The
Tom.
actor who plays Toad.
He was also Darth Maul.
Yeah.
So he's a badass.
You just want more work for Ray Park.
Yeah, he deserves it, damn it.
I think you're working harder than his agent ever has.
You mentioned Sabretooth. That's who I would probably give a spin-off to. I want to see the movie of how he turned from Liev Schreiber into this Sabretooth, because that's probably a weird transformation.
Well, this is weird, and it goes back to my theory that they had no idea that they would get a sequel, because he really should be related to Wolverine, and they don't even bother.
The other spin-off one is the kid who teleports playing basketball. I want to see like some like sports Airbud style movie
Should have
with
been
him.
him like Mike or something like that.
Dan's all here for that movie.
I totally am.
You know what? I'm gonna say who should get their spin-off of this movie would be Mystique. She put in the most work with the bodysuit. I think she could have had her own movie. She's one of the coolest characters that you don't get a lot of explanation for. It's literally just the henchman that can turn into people.
It is kind of like cheap though, because we have gotten these characters in other movies, so we kind of do have spin-offs and backstories.
I know, but thinking for that time period.
Yeah, no, I get it, and that makes sense.
I think it'd be really depressing, but obviously we talk about how the beginning of this movie starts off with like such an intense tone. It would be pretty cool to see like a very early origin story for him.
That would have been a good spin-off, prequel for him.
I mean, we kind of get it in
Yeah.
First Class, but yeah.
But we didn't know that at the time. That's
Sure. We're doing this podcast in November 2000. Next category is the producer's chair. If you could go back and change one thing about this movie, what would it be?
I don't really know why they chose Rogue, because that's not really her character. She was essentially a stand-in for Jubilee, and my thing that I would change is to go back, have Jubilee instead of Rogue. You can have Rogue be, one of the established X-Men. To go back and have an Asian actor be the heart of this new movie would have been really cool and really progressive.
I'm actually surprised to hear you say that, because I could have sworn you would have just said more Ray Park for your answer of what you would have changed about this movie.
Oh, you're right. I want Ray Park to play every character. We got it, guys. We got it.
I think I want more James Marsden, but that's probably just for selfish reasons.
We all want more
Because he's cute.
That's
He's
a
so
different movie.
cute.
One other obvious one we can talk about this with what didn't age well is to change the director. Bryan Singer is not a person that we fondly remember exactly.
Nope.
So I think he does a fine job in this movie, but just in terms of the legacy he's left, seeing Bryan Singer's name all over this movie is not my favorite.
It's one of those things where separating the art from the artist, if you want to call him an artist or this art. But he was kind of a good director choice at the time. I think that he actually did an okay job with it. But yeah, it makes you feel real gross.
For me in the producer's chair, I don't really know what I would change. I mean, selfishly, I think I'd maybe want more Ian McKellen, because he absolutely kills it in this.
Yeah.
Just more time with him, the more menacing, the better, because he really just comes off as a low-class Bond villain to me in this, even though they've set him up with such an emotional and solid reasoning for his actions.
Yeah.
All right, next category is questions. What questions does this movie bring up? Just plot points, weird things that happen.
So my big one right off the bat was when they're in the truck going away from the bar. She introduces herself as Rogue. When do they choose their X-Man name? Like it feels weird that she's just a runaway at this point, and she's like, I'm going Rogue. Oh, that's dope as hell.
Was she Rogue in high school in Mississippi?
Yeah, I
don't
say
know.
maybe that was her elementary school. I was like, I'm gonna go by Rogue and be cool, and that's why no one liked her. I don't know.
Do you think it would have been better, though, if, there would have been some cheesy part like, oh, you ran away from home, going rogue, and then, that she
That would have been
adopts it?
horrible.
Yeah,
There's no good way of doing it other than her
That would
just
have
saying
been
it.
like Han Solo.
Right, exactly. That's why I don't mind her just having it and being like, sure, whatever, moving on.
Yeah,
Because I don't even like her character all that much.
No, she's not good.
So,
Other questions. Magneto says he came to America in 1949. Why does he have a British accent?
well, maybe, he grew up in Poland, I'm assuming, and that he would have learned English in England. That's most Europeans. I have German friends that when they speak English, they speak British.
Sure, but he's also been in America for 60 years. I don't know.
We don't know that he stayed.
That's true.
For that
Right,
long.
right.
I have a lot of questions about Mystique's powers. Obviously, she can shapeshift into people, but she clearly has Wolverine's claws in this.
Right, she gets the abilities.
How does that... if she actually gets the full ability and all of their accessories, that's a lot of power.
Yeah,
But
that
here,
was
so
weird.
here though is that her claws aren't adamantium because he slices through them. So
And she screams.
yeah, so and that's why it almost feels like it should have cut some of her fingers off, which would have been
Like
excessive.
it's an extension
but
of herself. I don't know.
do the fragments of the claws get left behind, or do those disappear?
Ooh,
So that's tough.
The
that's a
physics
tough
don't
one.
make sense.
That's the kind of thing someone asked on set, and then they went, "Shut up."
Another question I had is, why the horses at the mansion? Well,
Why not?
Equestrian is a very important part of a balanced education.
It just seemed like it was like, hey, look how rich we are. We have horses.
Why the basketball court then, Tom?
Because
For
there
Dan.
are kids playing basketball because they go to school there.
The basketball thing brings up an interesting thought is how many athletes in this universe are actually mutants and they're not actually as
That's the
talented
kind
as
of thing
we
that
think.
keeps Dan up at night.
It really does.
Is Barry Bonds a mutant?
Barry Bonds is who you go with.
In a way, he is.
Not to get too political here, but let's talk about Senator Kelly a second. He's obviously nefarious and he has bad intentions.
You could just think of him as McCarthy for the most
Sure.
part.
But does he have kind of a point about hey, mutants could literally walk into the White House without any security, and he brings up the point later, it's we register guns, don't we? Does he have kind of a point for maybe, I understand the persecution part's bad, but the registration part, is that all that crazy?
That's an excellent question. There's been many comic book storylines asking that very question.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, maybe include it as a question on the census, but I feel like registration is.
I feel like the
is
flip side of that, in a world where America would embrace that, we would just immediately weaponize them. It would be real bad. It'd be real bad. It'd be an arms race of human beings. One of the questions I had in that scene that we brought up with all the guns being aimed at their own cops. There's one poor cop that the bullet is actually shot, and he just doesn't decide to move. Like, the bullet is so close to him, and he just winces in pain. Can't he back up?
It's basically the scene in Austin Powers with the steamroller. Stop!
Except much closer in
Yeah,
a bullet.
Right.
Like, I get maybe Magneto's keeping them there somehow.
Well, I would assume if he's got a lot of metal on his belt, so maybe that's what it was.
I mean, he can still like
move his head.
neck.
Yeah, there's no good excuse. For that.
I'm just thinking he's scared. That's
Yeah, I feel like in that moment you wouldn't be able to move. So
I think in that moment, if I was able to look and physically see a bullet in front of me, I would be like, back up. After I'd pooped myself.
Yeah,
that would have been the second thought.
Next category we have is the cringe factor. This is a category that'll for sure be used more as we watch these older movies. But really, this is what aged the worst and what doesn't look good anymore.
one of the huge standout things to me of what didn't age well or what was just kind of like, why, was the dramatic sound effects.
oh my god, they were
Like
so
the
bad.
neck cracking and like the slicing, and it was all just like just ridiculous.
It sounded like when they would write it in the comic panels, you know, the pow. It was
Right.
that extreme, but not cool.
Right.
Didn't seem like that was the reason why they did it.
No, that's what it made
No,
me
that's
think
just
of.
how dramatic it was.
We talked about Bryan Singer. Obviously, that has
Yeah.
not aged well. Another thing I didn't love was the cinematography, just the coloring of this. There are a couple times where they use like a very yellow tint, or just like it's very 90s to use that kind of style.
Can you even say they were trying to make it comic booky with it? Because I don't
Not-
think that
no.
I
works
don't
here.
think that's what I think it was just 90s.
I think it looks
Yeah.
like
And-
a movie from 1997.
And like the cinematography, like there's a lot of those really bad fast zooms and pans and stuff, and it's just
Yeah.
like, oh god, it was such a bad era.
truly the patina of the 90s.
Another way you can tell it's from this time period is that every big set piece of action is in the dark, like at
Yeah.
night, trying to disguise some of the special effects. Like, the train sequence of the Statue of Liberty. It's hard to really see what's going on, and it's so dark.
One of the most cringy things is when Wolverine's on the motorcycle and it's just the background blurring past.
I call
Ugh.
that the Men in Black moment. It's literally the red button for Men in Black, and then the super fast. That
Yeah,
was completely unnecessary.
bad.
I thought the effect of Senator Kelly turning into water was going to be bad, but it's pretty good considering.
It was
For its time, not bad.
Yeah, it's
very
not
Hollow
great,
Man.
but for that time
Yeah,
period,
it
Not
held
bad.
up okay. I mean, you still look at it and be like, oh, they were proud of that effect. But
Right.
same with him squeezing his head through the bars and it
oh, they
extends.
loved that.
Yeah, but it actually looks okay. I think the worst thing to have aged in that movie is Anna Paquin shoving beef jerky in her mouth, because boy does she look stupid doing that.
Yeah, Anna Paquin's acting I have written down here it's not great.
I'm pretty sure I've seen you eat beef jerky in a similar way, Tom. I don't think that's too ridiculous.
I don't know. I'd like to think I have a little class.
I thought that did go on a little longer than it needed to, but I was also like, is he going to say something to her? Like, save some room for later? Or go to say something?
All right, let's talk about the movie Legacy. Will this movie live on for future generations, and do we view this as a success?
I feel like as a standalone movie, in my opinion, it's kind of like, that was fine. But if you think about it as setting up sort of like the legacy that was to come after it and just opening the doors to something so much bigger than just this movie, then yes.
I agree. I think we can consider it a success because of what it launched. I don't think that kids that are growing up are really going to seek this out though, because Marvel now owns the property.
Right.
They're gonna reboot this. They're gonna have a fresh X-Men cast, and so they're never gonna go back to this.
I'm looking forward to that, but I do think Ian McKellen and Patrick Stewart will be cemented in time for any superhero films as maybe the best superhero casting of all time.
Well, I mean, same with Hugh Jackman though. Like,
Sure.
I mean,
Him as
he
well.
played that role for almost 20 years.
Those-
Like, it's gonna be really tough for whoever follows.
those three, I think, have cemented it. Even though the plot is meh,
Right.
Yeah.
that's enough.
It's the characters, it's also the civil rights parallel. Obviously, that's taken from the comics.
Yeah, I want to give credit to the movie.
Well, right, but I think watching it today was an eye opener when we were talking about like watching the senators talk about mutants. It's like, oh, that's a very interesting how that relates to today's.
There's some
talk about
parallels.
immigrants or other
America
minority
First.
groups.
It's
Yeah.
more potent today than it was in 2000.
I think so. I mean, I think in 2000, Bryan Singer's definitely going for more of an LGBTQ
Right.
parallel, which he actually does a lot better in X2, I think. But that message is going to relate to anyone just because our world is kind of that way, unfortunately.
Yeah.
I think there might always be that.
Yeah,
to tell
so
you the
I
truth.
think that is the reason maybe to watch these movies is because it's not just superheroes punching a villain. There's a little bit more going on underneath the surface.
That's something that the X-Men has always, stood for is that
The other,
that
basically.
fight. Yeah, whether the other is this thing to fear. So I don't think that this movie is necessarily going to survive because of that message, because that message is going to continue on with the next property.
So I think we'd agree that if anything is the legacy of this movie, it's just the performances.
Yeah.
Maybe more than the story itself.
I think so.
Sure. We'll get to X2 in a couple episodes, I'm sure. I generally think X2 is the better movie. I think it explores
I'm
the
excited for
characters a
that.
little bit better. And obviously X-Men, the franchise, goes in some ups and downs.
I
We'll get
can't
to
wait.
those.
This has been fun.
All right, next movie in our series. We're going chronologically, the year 2000. The next film is M. Night Shyamalan's Unbreakable.
Oh.
I'm excited for that.
Shamalama Ding Dong.
And you three have seen this movie. I have never seen Unbreakable.
I'm excited for you to see it.
I saw Split, so I know how that movie relates to that one, but I've not seen Unbreakable all the way through.
There are some people who really, really love Unbreakable, so it'll be fun to dissect that.
It wasn't until after Split that I saw it, and I'll talk about this, I'm sure, again in that podcast, but for some reason someone had spoiled that movie for me, and I just had the spoiler in the back of my head, but could not tell you the name of the film. So once I was watching, I go, oh, I know exactly where this is going.
All right, so that'll do it. We'll do Unbreakable next time. We've got some good movies coming up, some good classic early superhero movies. I'm talking Spider-Man, the original, Ang Lee's Hulk, the original Fantastic Four.
Wait till we get to Spider-Man 2
I
and
was gonna
Dan loses his gun.
I was going to say, we got to take a moment to say that this whole podcast was just made so that Dan could gush about Spider-Man 2.
Pay attention, folks. It's a great movie. Have a rewatch. It's going to be great. But we're not there yet. We'll get there eventually. All right, so that's our episode of Superhero Century. Hope you enjoyed. This is part of the Cinema Composite channel. Like and subscribe if you're watching on YouTube, and we will see you next time.